My son-in-law whispered in my ear at Christmas dinner that I was a burden to them. I was sitting at their table, helping my 8-year-old granddaughter cut her turkey, when Brad leaned over and said those words so quietly that only I could hear them. The fork fell from my hand, and for a moment the whole room seemed to stop spinning around me. If you've ever been made to feel unwanted in your own family, if you've ever had someone whisper poison in your ear while everyone else is smiling, settle in close. Because this story's got more twists than a mountain road in the ending? Well, let's just say some people learn the hard way that you should never underestimate a quiet old man. That whisper changed everything about how I saw my place in this world. For 2 years since my wife Margaret passed, I'd been living in their guest room, trying to be helpful, trying not to be in the way, trying to figure out where I fit now that the love of my life was gone. I thought I was contributing, helping with the kids, sharing expenses when I could. Turns out Brad saw me as dead weight. I remember finishing dinner in complete silence while conversation flowed around me like I wasn't even there. My daughter Sarah was talking about the kids' school projects. Emma was showing off her loose tooth. Jake was describing his soccer game, and there I was. Harold Thompson, 62 years old, widower, former electrical engineer, feeling smaller than a dust particle in my own granddaughter's dollhouse. The worst part wasn't even the words themselves, though they cut deep enough to leave scars. It was the casual cruelty of it, the way Brad said it like he was commenting on the weather, like, my feelings didn't matter because old people are supposed to just accept being unwanted. Like I was supposed to nod and agree that, yes, I was indeed a burden. Thank you for pointing that out. But here's what Brad Miller didn't know about Harold Thompson. I'd spent 40 years solving electrical problems, fixing things that seemed impossible to fix, and I wasn't about to let some car salesman with a superiority complex write the final chapter of my story. I had a pension, I had savings, and I had something Brad clearly lacked: a functioning brain and the patience to use it properly. That night, lying in their guest bed listening to them argue about money through the thin walls, I made a decision that would shock everyone in that house, especially the man who thought a grieving widower was too old and too broken to fight back. And if you want to hear how a burden became a millionaire in 2 years, hit that subscribe button on Grandpa's Diaries. Trust me, you're going to want to see how this one plays out. Sarah wasn't always married to a man who whispered cruelty at family dinners. My little girl, and she'll always be my little girl even at 35, used to bring home boys who respected her father, who shook my hand firmly and called me "sir" without being asked. Brad was different from the start. Charming as a snake oil salesman, but with eyes that never quite met mine when he spoke. Like he was always calculating something behind that practiced smile. When Margaret was alive, we used to joke about Brad's ambition, how he talked about building wealth and maximizing opportunities, like he was reading from a business textbook. Margaret would whisper to me after family dinners, "That boy's got dollar signs where his heart should be, Harry." She was never wrong about people, my Margaret. 43 years of marriage taught me to trust her instincts about character, especially when it came to protecting our daughter. After the funeral, when the casseroles stopped coming and the sympathy cards quit arriving, Sarah insisted I move in with them. "Dad, you can't stay in that big house all alone," she said, tears in her eyes that reminded me so much of her mother. "We've got the guest room. The kids love having Grandpa around, and frankly, we could use help with the mortgage." That last part was Brad's influence talking, I could tell. But Sarah meant well. Those first few months I thought things were working out fine. I helped Emma with her homework every night, taught Jake how to throw a proper curveball in the backyard, did the grocery shopping when Sarah worked late at the elementary school where she taught 3rd grade. I paid for utilities, bought groceries, fixed things around the house that Brad never seemed to have time for. Leaky faucets, squeaky hinges, the kind of maintenance that saves money in the long run. But I started noticing the signs that I wasn't as welcome as Sarah pretended. Brad would make comments about crowded spaces and privacy concerns when he thought I couldn't hear. He'd sigh dramatically when I'd join them for their evening Netflix shows, like my presence was ruining some intimate moment. Worst of all, he started treating me like hired help instead of family, asking me to babysit on short notice, expecting me to be grateful for the privilege. The breaking point should have been obvious earlier. But grief makes you blind to a lot of things. Margaret used to handle all the social navigation, all the family politics, all the reading between the lines that I was apparently terrible at. Without her, I was stumbling through relationships like a man walking in the dark, missing obvious signs that Brad Miller had never wanted a father-in-law in his house. Sarah loved me. That was never in question. But Sarah also loved Brad, and love makes smart women do stupid things sometimes. She started making excuses for his behavior, explaining away his rudeness as stress from work, or adjusting to having 3 generations under one roof. I could see her caught between loyalty to her husband and love for her father, and it was tearing her apart in ways that broke my heart all over again. The shift started subtly in the fall, about 6 months after I'd moved in. Like autumn leaves changing color so gradually you don't notice until the whole tree looks different. Brad began making comments about retirement planning and how people our age needed to think about the future, meaning my future was becoming his problem. He'd bring up articles he'd supposedly read about seniors living with family, always emphasizing the financial strain and the loss of independence for everyone involved. "Harry, you know we love having you here," he'd say during dinner, using that tone people use when they're about to say something they definitely don't mean. "But we're starting to think about college funds for the kids, maybe expanding Sarah's classroom budget, and, well, 3 adults in one house gets expensive." Sarah would shoot him warning looks across the table, but he'd just smile that car salesman smile and keep pushing. The passive-aggressive comments became a daily occurrence. He'd mention how much the electricity bill had gone up since I'd moved in, how the grocery budget was stretched thin, how they might need to look into assisted living options because everyone deserves their independence. Each comment was delivered with a concerned expression, like he was genuinely worried about my well-being instead of trying to push me out. What hurt most was watching Sarah start to question whether I was happy there. Brad was poisoning the well so effectively that my own daughter began asking if I wouldn't be more comfortable in a senior community, if I wouldn't have more friends my own age somewhere else. He was turning my presence from a gift into a burden, making Sarah feel guilty for wanting to help her widowed father. The kids started picking up on the tension too. Emma would ask why Uncle Brad never smiled when Grandpa was around, why Mommy and Daddy whispered so much after bedtime, why everyone seemed sad even when we were supposed to be having fun. Jake, bless his heart, started defending me in small ways, insisting I sit next to him at dinner, asking for my help with homework even when Sarah offered, choosing me for his team during family game nights. Thanksgiving was when I realized how deep Brad's resentment really ran. We were setting the table together while Sarah carved the turkey, and he started talking about long-term arrangements and realistic expectations. "Harry, you're a smart guy," he said, arranging forks like he was conducting an orchestra. "You've got to see that this living situation isn't sustainable forever, right? I mean, Sarah and I are trying to build something here." The way he said something made it clear that I wasn't part of whatever future he was envisioning. I was an obstacle to be managed, a problem to be solved, a temporary inconvenience that had overstayed its welcome. The man who'd married my daughter, who'd promised to love and honor her family, was treating her father like a roommate who'd forgotten to pay rent. That night, lying in the guest bed that Brad increasingly made feel like borrowed space, I started making lists in my head. Assets, options, possibilities I hadn't considered because I'd been too grief-stricken and too trusting to think strategically. Margaret always said I was too nice for my own good, too willing to assume the best about people. Maybe it was time to prove her wrong about that. Christmas Eve arrived with all the forced cheer of a department store holiday display, bright on the surface, but hollow underneath where it counted. Sarah had gone all out decorating the house, trying to create the magical Christmas she remembered from her childhood when Margaret was alive to orchestrate every detail. The tree was perfect. The stockings were hung with mathematical precision, and the smell of her mother's sugar cookie recipe filled the house like a ghost of better times. I'd spent weeks shopping for the perfect gifts, using money from my pension to buy Emma the art supplies she'd been dreaming about, and Jake the remote control helicopter he'd circled in every toy catalog. For Sarah, I'd found a locket with Margaret's birthstone, something to help her feel close to her mother during our first Christmas without her. Even for Brad, I'd bought an expensive set of golf accessories, hoping maybe generosity could bridge whatever gap had opened between us. The dinner was beautiful. Prime rib that melted in your mouth, mashed potatoes creamy as clouds, green bean casserole made from Margaret's secret recipe that Sarah had finally mastered. The kids were excited, talking over each other about Santa and presents and school vacation plans. For a few hours, it felt like we might actually be a family celebrating together, instead of strangers sharing a meal. But Brad had been drinking wine all afternoon, and alcohol always made his true thoughts leak out around the edges of his careful facade. I noticed him getting louder, more animated, his comments getting sharper and more pointed. Sarah kept giving him warning looks, but he was past the point of reading social cues or caring about keeping up appearances. After dinner, while Sarah was in the kitchen loading the dishwasher and the kids were in the living room playing with their new toys, Brad cornered me in the dining room. I was clearing plates, trying to be helpful like always, when he moved close enough that I could smell the wine on his breath and see the cold calculation in his eyes that Margaret had warned me about years ago. "Harry," he said quietly, glancing toward the kitchen to make sure Sarah couldn't hear. "We need to talk about your situation here. This whole arrangement isn't working out the way we hoped." His voice was low, controlled, but there was something predatory in his tone that made my skin crawl. I kept stacking plates, hoping he'd just say whatever he needed to say and leave me alone. That's when he leaned even closer, his mouth almost touching my ear like he was sharing a secret, and delivered the words that would change everything between us forever. "You are a burden to us," he whispered, each word carefully chosen and deliberately cruel. "Sarah's too kind to say it, but we're tired of taking care of you. You're cramping our style, costing us money, and frankly, we'd all be happier if you found somewhere else to be." The plate slipped from my hands and crashed to the floor, the sound echoing through the house like thunder. Sarah came rushing in from the kitchen asking what happened, and Brad immediately switched into concerned son-in-law mode. "Oh no, Harry, are you okay? Don't worry about the mess, these things happen at our age, right?" But his eyes were smiling while his mouth said sympathetic words, and I knew that broken china was exactly the metaphor he'd been hoping for. I spent the rest of Christmas night picking up pieces of broken china, while my heart felt like it was shattering in the same pattern. Sarah kept apologizing for the accident, helping me sweep up fragments while Brad lounged in his recliner, watching football and acting like nothing had happened. The kids asked why Grandpa looked sad, and I had to paste on a smile and tell them I was just tired, just getting old and dropping things. For 3 days after Christmas, I barely spoke to anyone in that house. I helped with the kids when Sarah asked, fixed a leaky pipe, shoveled snow from the driveway, but I moved through those routines like a ghost haunting his own life. Brad's words echoed in my head during every interaction. "You are a burden," turning every kind gesture from Sarah into potential pity, every hug from the grandkids into obligation. The worst part was the doubt that crept in during long winter nights when I couldn't sleep. Maybe Brad was right. Maybe I was fooling myself thinking I was helpful instead of being a drain on their resources. Maybe at 62, a widower should be able to live independently instead of crowding into someone else's space like an unwanted house guest. I started spending more time in my room, coming out only for meals and necessary interactions. Sarah noticed. Mothers always notice. But when she asked if I was okay, I blamed it on missing Margaret during the holidays. It wasn't entirely a lie. Everything hurt worse when her absence felt like a physical wound that wouldn't heal. January brought new reminders of my unwelcome status. Brad started talking about future plans that clearly didn't include me, discussing vacations and home improvements with the assumption that I'd be elsewhere when those dreams became reality. He'd catch my eye during these conversations, making sure I understood I wasn't part of the us he kept referring to. The breaking point came on a snowy Tuesday when I overheard Brad on the phone, probably with his brother, complaining about the old man situation. His voice carried down the hallway where I was folding laundry. "It's like having a permanent house guest who doesn't get the hint," he was saying. "Sarah's too soft-hearted to do what needs to be done, so I'm the bad guy for being realistic." That afternoon, while Sarah was at work and Brad was at the dealership, I sat in my room with a yellow legal pad and started making lists. Assets, pension payments, Social Security, life insurance money Margaret and I had saved, our modest investment account. Expenses, minimal if I lived alone, manageable if I was smart. Options, more than Brad Miller had bothered to consider before writing me off as a burden to be managed. It was my old colleague Tom Chen who opened my eyes to possibilities I'd never considered. Sitting across from me at a coffee shop downtown on a gray February morning, Tom had retired from the same engineering firm 3 years earlier, but unlike me, he'd spent his retirement getting rich instead of getting comfortable. "Harry," he said, stirring sugar into his coffee, "you're sitting on a gold mine and living like you're broke. That's not grief talking, that's just bad math." Tom showed me his investment portfolio on his phone, numbers that made my eyes water. 6 figures that had grown into 7 through careful stock picks, cryptocurrency investments, and what he called strategic speculation. He'd turned his retirement savings into serious wealth by treating the market like an engineering problem. Systematic, logical, predictable if you understood the patterns. The secret isn't having a lot of money to start, Tom explained, showing me charts that looked like electrical schematics. It's having discipline to research, patience to wait for opportunities, and courage to act when everyone else is scared. You've got 40 years of problem-solving experience. The stock market is just another system to figure out. That night, I spread Tom's recommended books across my bed like I was studying for the most important exam of my life. The Intelligent Investor, cryptocurrency articles that read like science fiction but made mathematical sense. For the first time since Margaret died, I felt my brain engaging with something that could change my circumstances instead of just accepting them. I opened my first trading account using half my life insurance money, $50,000 Margaret and I had saved for emergencies. Being called a burden by your son-in-law qualified as an emergency. I started with index funds and blue-chip stocks Tom recommended, learning terminology and watching the market move like a giant electrical grid with predictable patterns. The cryptocurrency part scared me initially, seemed like gambling, but Tom explained blockchain technology like a distributed electrical system that couldn't be controlled by any single authority. As an engineer, I appreciated the elegance, the revolutionary potential most people my age dismissed as fake money. 6 months in, my portfolio had grown 30%. Not life-changing yet, but proof the system worked, that an old engineer could learn new tricks. I reinvested everything, adding monthly pension payments, living off Social Security, and the small rent I paid Sarah for the privilege of being called a burden. By Christmas, exactly 12 months after Brad's whispered cruelty, my investments had crossed 6 figures. I was quietly becoming wealthy while living in the guest room of a man who thought I was too old to matter. The irony wasn't lost on me. Neither was the growing sense of power from having options. Brad had no idea he was housing a millionaire in the making, and I intended to keep it that way until the moment was right. 2 years after Brad whispered those poison words in my ear, I'm sitting in my own home office, emphasis on my own, looking at investment statements that show $1.8 million in assets. The burden who was cramping their style had learned something Brad's business degree apparently never taught him. Compound interest and good timing can turn a grieving widower into a wealthy man faster than most people think possible. The house I bought is nothing flashy, just a comfortable 3-bedroom ranch in a quiet neighborhood 20 minutes from Sarah's place. Close enough for the grandkids to visit whenever they want. Far enough away that I never have to hear Brad's opinions about my life choices again. I paid cash, no mortgage, no debt, just the sweet satisfaction of financial independence that tastes better than any revenge I could have planned. Sarah was shocked when I announced I was moving out, even more shocked when she saw the house I'd bought. "Dad, how did you afford this?" she asked, walking through rooms that were twice the size of anything in her house. I just smiled and told her I'd gotten better at managing money since her mother died. Brad stood in my new kitchen, calculating square footage and property values, finally understanding that the old man he'd dismissed as a burden was worth more than he'd ever be. The best part wasn't the money itself, though having financial security feels like a warm blanket on a cold night. It was watching Brad's face when he realized what he'd lost. Not just the free childcare and household help I'd provided, but the future inheritance he'd been counting on. All those comments about family assets and long-term planning suddenly looked different when the family asset was walking away with enough money to change everything. I still see Sarah and the kids every week, sometimes more often than when I lived there. Emma loves her new art room in my house, where she can paint without worrying about making a mess. Jake practices baseball in my backyard, where there's actual space to run and throw. Sarah admits the house feels emptier without me, quieter in ways that aren't necessarily better. Brad doesn't say much during family dinners anymore. The funny thing about being underestimated is how liberating it becomes once you prove the doubters wrong. For 2 years, I let Brad think I was a helpless old man who needed their charity to survive. Meanwhile, I was learning about blockchain technology, studying market trends, making investment decisions that would have impressed Tom Chen. Sometimes the best revenge is simply becoming successful enough that the person who hurt you becomes irrelevant. I never told Sarah exactly what Brad said that Christmas night, never explained the real reason I decided to become financially independent so quickly. Some wounds are meant to heal privately, and some victories are sweeter when you don't have to explain them to anyone. The man who called me a burden learned that burdens can become blessings when they're motivated properly. These days I sleep better than I have since Margaret died. Not because the grief is gone, but because I've built something she would have been proud of. I took the worst moment of my widowerhood and turned it into the foundation for the best chapter of my life. Brad Miller taught me that I was stronger than I knew, though I doubt that was his intention. Tell me in the comments, have you ever been written off by someone who should have valued you? Have you ever used someone else's cruelty as motivation to build something better? Don't forget to subscribe to Grandpa's Diaries, because I've got more stories about late-life comebacks, quiet victories, and the sweet satisfaction of proving that age is just a number when you've got the will to keep fighting. Sometimes the people who hurt us the most end up giving us exactly the push we needed.